Yeah, and it was interesting in the beginning of the season because we come on air and every time we'd say, "Wow, the Falcons kind of like blew that thing out of the water," because every line that was there, whether on BetOnline, of course, like you said, it didn't matter. The Falcons just did what they did. I think they blew it up like 7 times.
Right, exactly.
And speaking of seven, of course, ultimately they end this season 7-10, just as last year. But a couple of nuanced differences to how it ended last season versus this season. And one of them is according to a report from Field Yates, and that is that on the final day for the Falcons to be able to take advantage of 2022 cap space, they actually accelerated some of Jake Matthews' money, $7 million to be exact. And that would
Hmm.
have been 2023 roster bonus money onto this league year, which creates $4.2 million of 2023 cap space as a result. And that's a good thing because of two things. Number one, you see Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith already churning. Their minds are already trying to figure out how to get them even more cap space. And number two, I feel like that also tells us, Jarvis, that not only are their minds churning, but they're going to be aggressive with how they approach free agency now that they're able to just continue to kind of stack chips to go after the guys they want and need for next year's roster.
And to like the prime evidence of that, and this is something that's been kind of going in my mind. I'm thinking like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, you go 7-10 in your first year, and you have a quarterback that's pretty much on his way out, and we come to find out that he fell off a cliff. So thankfully, you were able to trade him, get some compensation for him that was viable that you used to end the rebuild, and you go 7-10 in that year, and then this year, coming into this year, you brought in a veteran quarterback like Marcus Mariota. You gave him a team-friendly deal where you're going to be able to save some money if you cut him before the new league year starts in
Mm-hmm.
2023. And you draft a guy that you fell in love with that down at the Senior Bowl in Desmond Ridder, and you got a chance to get a nice 4 game sample size of what you could be able to do with him in this offense. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
when you got a guy in Jake Matthews,
Right.
because for those who don't know, Jake Matthews is going to have the highest cap percentage in 2023. So
Mm-hmm.
for them to be able to move some money around to free up
Yeah.
some more bread to go ahead and add to this year and go into this year, I think, like you said, 7-10, 7-10. Now
Mm-hmm.
it's time to start to get aggressive, like you
Yeah.
mentioned, and start spending some money so you can be a team that can really compete and not just be in games, but really have opportunities to come into games being the
Yeah.
favorite. We talked about
Exactly.
BetOnline.net all year as far as
Mm-hmm.
whether or not the Falcons were favored going to the games.
Yep.
Now you're talking about adding some pieces that can, in
Mm-hmm.
free agency and in the draft, is to make this team better. Right?
Yeah.
And not necessarily say hope and pray that you're able to stay in games and get a win at the end. So I think that's those days are over with, and I think this organization, by this move, it may be a small move, but I think by this move, it lets you know that the front office is going to be super aggressive going into this offseason.
Yeah, and you have a situation like you mentioned with Mariota versus Ritter, and you get to take advantage of taking that 18,750,000 2-year contract and essentially cutting it in half. Of course, there's a $5 million bonus, 6.7 mil guaranteed, but hey, you get Desmond Ridder for just 1.5 mil.
Yep.
So winning once again, in addition to the quantity of the contract, the quality of the play of Ridder. So speaking of him, it's very interesting because I think most of us went back and forth on the quality of play in 4 games and whether or not that was a big enough sample size, right, to show
Right.
that Falcons coaching staff what they would need to know in order to determine if they need to go after another quarterback in the draft. Because I think we do agree that, yeah, you can go after a quarterback in free agency, but real talk, you really kind of need to find somebody who is accepting of the number 2 spot. Because I don't think you really have a free agent out there under center that really A, you can or want to afford, and B, you kind of sort of have a guy who is looking like he's trending up to QB1. But that said, do you feel like confident or do you have more confidence at this point that he is indeed good enough to be QB1, or you got to see more?
I feel like he's good enough. I've seen enough for him to come back in 2023 and be QB1. Whether that not he's going to be the guy going forward for the next 10 years, I can't answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen enough, but I have seen enough to say, you know what? I do like this combination of young talent that they have, and
Mm-hmm.
Tyler Allgeier and Drake
Yeah.
London and Desmond Ridder. I like the connection
Mm-hmm.
that those two guys have, and I
Yes.
like
Oh,
how Tyler
definitely.
Allgeier is
Definitely.
toting that rock behind this offensive line. So, and I think that there is still some room for upgrade on the offensive line as well. We talked
True.
about
True. True.
60% coming into the season being
Mm-hmm.
unknown. If they bring back Caleb McGarry, and they're fine with Drew Dahlman at center.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, you could spend a little change at that left guard spot, or
Yeah.
draft a
Yeah.
guy, take a chance on a guy in that first round that you say, you know what, we don't normally draft guards this high,
Right.
but
But
we feel like this guy can be the guy to truly solidify that offensive line up front.
indeed. Yeah. And I agree as well. Like you really have some opportunities to kind of flex and flow. And as you start to do it this early and often, especially because we know that so many of the top notch O linemen for this season were locked up late in the season by their respective teams. But like
Yes.
you said, this is still giving you some flexibility to where if there's an O lineman out there at left guard primarily because that's kind of your spot that's kind of up in the air. You still have some flexibility to be able to go out there, even in the draft,
Yeah.
and still get someone. But yeah, I love what they're doing, especially because speaking of Tyler Allgeier, you really have somebody who, I mean, we can't talk enough about what he did, even putting an exclamation point on the season with a 135-yard performance against the Bucks. So I feel like also as we're talking futuristically, right?
Right.
Feel like he really gave us a sneak peek into the future that you're talking about an O line that's more solidified. You're talking about a little bit more of a solid feel or a comfortable feel under center. You already know in your wide receiver and tight end room, you're good. But
Yeah.
now to know that your running back by committee has actually gotten stronger. Because remember, we call this a running back by committee almost from day one.
Yeah.
But I believe that hits different now that Tyler Allgeier has become what he's become.
You have a foundation, right? Because that was the difference between 7-10 after in Arthur Smith's first season as a coach and
Mm-hmm.
7-10 after this season. Because like we
Yeah.
mentioned, like Matt Ryan going out, and you got old
Mm-hmm.
guys that are getting paid a lot of money, and Deion Jones, and who's gonna get rid of who, and all that stuff. You don't
Mm-hmm.
have those conversations anymore.
Nope.
Now it's about who you can add to the pieces that you already brought in. You got
Mm-hmm.
Kyle Pitts, who broke the rookie receiving record. You got
Right.
Drake London, who broke his rookie receiving record. So in back-to-back
Exactly.
years. So I
Yeah.
think that those are some of the things that can be foundational pieces going forward.
Mm-hmm.
And let's keep it funky. Cheap labor. You know what I'm saying? Like you can have cheap labor in those foundational pieces and at the quarterback position. So you're following that Seattle model that
Mm-hmm.
came out a little bit earlier on in the week as far as what the Falcons are trying to do. You have a third round quarterback, and then you just build around him.
Yes.
So if he doesn't end up being that guy, you still
Mm-hmm.
have a plug and play type situation.
You definitely do. And you also have things looking up on defense. I love something that Dean Pease talked about earlier today. Of course, we know he is officially in retirement, but he's been
Indeed.
kind of doing his rounds with his, we'll call it postseason retirement pressers. So he
Right.
talked to
Yeah.
our guys, John and Hugh, over at 92.9 this morning. And one of the things that he said was he felt like the defense really, really showed what it was about. And if you just look at the sample size of the back nine games of the season versus the first eight, you'll see a team that was where they said they wanted to be, which was top 10 in the league. So
Right.
when you start thinking about that, and Hugh asked him a question that, man, I loved the question and I also loved the answer because Hugh asked him about players that he thought essentially were putting themselves or the Falcons in really good hands next year, especially some of those young guys. But he called out somebody that we talked about before, Rashaan Evans. He said that was a really, really good pickup, and he was pleased with what he saw out of him. Even gave Lorenzo Carter, some credit, but really kind of focused on Rashaan in terms of veteran gets. He also said that he really, really liked the play, called out Richie Grant, said he had a good season, called out Arnold Abakati, and
Yeah.
said he had a good season. And even a Troy Anderson, who the more reps he gets at linebacker for somebody who played quarterback in some other positions, the
Yeah.
better he's getting. So I think that's the other piece for us as well. When you look at the quarterback of the defense, Grady Jarrett, and what he said in that last game, and now what Dean Pease has said days later, I think the defense is also building a foundation
Yeah.
that like we say, if they can just get some pieces, then they will be good to go. So if you want to talk about pieces, and a team that already has all the pieces, I mean, you heard us talk about them earlier. That's Georgia. You know where else you
Yes.
can find out about those big pieces and what we call it the world championship, even though they say college football, but that world championship in college football, you can go to Locked On Sports Today because they talk about all the big stories, not just what's going on in the NFL, which has kind of been quiet the last 24 hours. You haven't heard a lot about any other coaches getting their walking papers, but you know where all the buzz is? About them dogs. So if you want to hear more about that, check out Locked On Sports Today. You know where they are on YouTube. They are on the Odyssey app, and of course, everywhere that you download this podcast, that is where you should check them out. And of course, you love Forward the Culture, don't you? Well, check out their take of the day. That is where they talk about all things that they want to talk about just because. Again, that's Locked On Sports Today. Don't forget to check them out as soon as you wrap up checking out ATL Day Ones.